Hello everyone. Welcome to the final day of Kerala Literature Festival 2024. We saved some of the best for the last. Here at THOOLIKA, we're about to launch into a discussion of the stunning debut novel Quarterlife with its author Devika Rege. Devika, welcome to Kozhikode. It's so lovely to have you here and I'm thrilled to get to do this with you. Shall we get the ball rolling? Okay, so let's start with you. Your bio in the book is quite sparse. There's no placing of yourself beyond Pune, no mention of the fact that you went to the Iowa Writers' Workshop. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your writing journey, your early influences, and what led you to the creation of this ambitious novel that tackles India against the backdrop of the 2014 national elections?
So I grew up in Pune. And it was a very apolitical upbringing. So my father, he's no more now, but he ran a small business in Pune. And everyone in the family was an engineer or an MBA or a doctor. There were no writers for miles. And so just this idea that one could do this in any capacity other than, a weekend hobby, which is what it was for me as a child, didn't occur to me until my mid-20s almost. And at that time, I had graduated from Mumbai University and I had a corporate job with Unilever. So I was in marketing. And the job took me, what was interesting about that job was for 4 years, I traveled to over 15 states. I was traveling every week. And from being this Bombay Pune girl, it suddenly gave me a much wider sense of the country. And that was when this desire to write about everything that I was seeing took hold. I didn't feel that I knew enough to launch or to speak of myself as a writer. And so at some point, I took a sabbatical and I applied for a degree in writing, which is how I landed up going to the States for 2 years and studying there. I was very fortunate to have a full scholarship. There was no way my parents were going to spend, any money getting their kid educated as a writer. And so I went there, and when I came back, it was 2013. And it was a really electric time. I think just to take some of y'all in the audience back to that time, we had the anti-corruption movements. We had, the High Court, the Supreme Court had recriminalized homosexuality. So we had a lot of pride movements in the metros. Following the Nirbhaya case, there was a lot of vigils for women's safety. And so suddenly, from having left India as this corporate person wanting to write something, I came back and found myself marching in the streets. And, and then the election comes in, and some people are very excited about the result. It's the change they've been waiting to see. And others are shocked by the result that all this progressive rage had kind of culminated in this victory for the BJP. And personally, for me, what was exciting was just the way in which that election really transformed the relationship of the middle class to politics. Politics was no longer something that happened either among the uber elite and big businesses or then in the slums. Suddenly, everybody who just used to maybe vote on voting day and maybe watch the 9 o'clock news had all these opinions on what the country stands for, what our history is, what democracy is about. And, our political identities just took on this much wider dimension than they ever had. And so that, for me, was, on the one hand, the milieu was familiar enough because I'd grown up in it. But on the other hand, what they were going through was unfamiliar enough for me to really want to explore it as a writer. And so that's how I started writing Quarterlife, and the book came to be.
So for those of you in the audience who haven't read the book yet, a brief synopsis. Set in the aftermath of a divisive election in which the Bharat Party has kicked the Conclave Party out of power. You know who they stand for. The book largely revolves around 3 characters, Naren Agashe, Rohit Agashe, and Amanda. Naren is a disillusioned US-based consultant who returns to India lured by the economic promises of the new government. Amanda is his American friend from college who comes to India on a social sector fellowship. And Rohit, Naren's younger brother, sets out to understand his roots and befriends an earnest young filmmaker who is part of the Hindutva ecosystem. So through these characters and their friend circles and their families, you get this very sprawling portrait of how 20, 30 somethings are grappling with and navigating this new shining India. So having set that context, let's get down to the brass tacks. For a novel that's interrogating the undercurrents of this supposedly new India, the Agashe brothers as key characters, they make sense. They're upper caste, they're wealthy, this sort of very fertile ground to examine privilege, ambition, desire, insecurity, all of that. I'm curious about how Amanda, a white woman, made her way into the book. What does she throw into the light about the nation and its rising elite? What does she bring to the table that perhaps another Savarna woman in the development sector doesn't or couldn't bring to the table?
So I think the dynamic between East and West is something that has been such a part of our coming to a certain kind of national identity for several centuries now. And there was a time when I think Britain was overwhelming in that national consciousness. I grew up in the 90s when it was all about America. You know, post-liberalization, we all wanted to wear American brands. We were watching American sitcoms on TV. There was this brain drain where anybody who was doing better in school than I was, you know, left for the US for their studies and settled there. And so to write this novel about what it is to be Indian in some way, without acknowledging at all that, you know, that any of this has a role in it, to me would have been striking. I think that said, you know, if this was a novel, I don't know, you know, this question has come up before, and I do wonder what it says about our own conception of place that a foreigner should not find a voice in this novel. If we see this as a novel about India, and India as a place for only those people who have a passport and an Indian citizenship, then no, of course, Amanda's presence in the novel doesn't make sense. But if we see this as the story of a place, not India, and it's not the story of India, but a place, a geographic location, then, you know, of course, there are a lot of foreigners in Bombay. There is a lot of foreign capital. There is a lot of foreign aid. There are many ways in which America has influenced our cultural life, our ideological life. The very idea of democracy and the nation is a Western concept. And so, of course, then that kind of a character finds a home in the novel. And it's not surprising that it is Amanda's influence that sets Rohit off on his roots tour that, you know, that sort of propels him into this quest for the nation. Yeah, so I think that, at least that was the reason that she sort of found voice in the novel initially. But, you know, as any writer in the audience would know, those goalposts keep shifting. The character evolves, it takes on a life of its own, and it must, because you don't want a character to be entirely instrumental. And I hope that Amanda transcends just her position in the work as an American, and that she has a complexity that goes beyond that. And finally, there's really this question of just the gaze, you know. And Rohit and Naren are so desperate to be free of the gaze. But what happens when the gaze, you know, there's a person behind the gaze. What happens when that person is destroyed? Are we liberated? Are we really free? Or has that violence hurt us as well in some other way? And so I think it was really important for me to have Amanda there, and for the reader to think about these questions. It was important that Amanda is a really full-blooded character, that we don't flatten those in positions of privilege any more than we flatten those who are not, because both make, you know, they make the question or they make the project weaker in different ways. So that's Amanda in the novel. Yeah.
I think one thing that I really liked about your characterization of Amanda is that at some point you point out that she's not the same kind of white woman that Narayan's ex Kathy is. There are gradations to the whiteness, and where in America you come from, different kinds of sophistication. And I think that really speaks to the depth of characterization in this novel. Narayan, for example, reminded me of so many of the IIT tech bros that I've hung out with in real life and wanted to strangle. And there's Rohit, who's someone I really badly wanted to slot him into a neat box. But he was an even more compelling character with his charisma, curiosity. And despite his sinking deeper into the Hindutva machinery, there was something very universal and identifiable about his underlying impulses, his need to belong somewhere, the desire to do something meaningful with your life. And I love how you gather all of these very universal impulses and map them onto the state of the nation. And how all of this is rooted in the very specific geography and history of Maharashtra. So let's talk about place. What led you to decide, okay, I'm going to set Quarterlife in Maharashtra, apart from the fact that you're from Pune?
So yes, there was of course a familiarity with the state. Though generally in the novel, I've never let familiarity or lack of familiarity kind of determine what the project needed. But I do also think Maharashtra is a very interesting case study in itself as regards the rise of Hindu nationalism. I mean, it's a vast state. It's a wealthy state. It's a state that's very far away from the Hindi-speaking heartland. And so why is Maharashtra the ideological home of the Hindu right? You know, why isn't it Ayodhya? Why isn't it UP? Why isn't it someplace? Why isn't it, you know, Delhi? When I think of the young men I interviewed in, say, small town Satara, and there's no partition trauma over there. At least in Bombay, you can say there were a lot of partition refugees. You can't say that of Heartland Maharashtra. So why does a young man like Omkar, who's one of the characters in the book, why is he voting for the Bharat Party? You know? And so these were the kind of questions that I wanted to interrogate, and I think the location of Maharashtra was to be more interesting and complicated. You know, in some ways, the ideological project is more naked there than I think it may have been closer to other kinds of essential centers.
Okay, so since we were talking about Rohit, you know, let's read a passage from his Roots tour.
So this is where the character Rohit, who's a young man with a very cosmopolitan upbringing in Mumbai, decides that he wants to find out more about his ancestry and where his community comes from, which of course later on he realizes that community is just a euphemism for his caste. But this is the moment when he is setting out on this Roots tour. The Konkan coast has no formal boundaries. In some maps, even Bombay is on it. Though when Baba says Amsa Konkan, he means the shadowy strip between the hills and the sea that everyone bypasses on the expressway to Goa. And this is the land that Rohit wants to discover when he drives out in the old Civic, the windows roll down and the monsoon wind in his hair. Online, he has described his #Roots tour as a trip to retrace his forefathers' journey from Velneshwar to Ratnagiri to Pune and to visit some historical sites on the way, a template he received from Amanda. Then she declined his invitation to join him, which is fine. If this is a trip to understand all the threads that end up in his person, it's fair that he should make it in his own company. The first rains are breaking over the great escarpment, its lack of vertical glory made up for by its horizontal expanse. And scanning the land for resonance, every detail feels imperative. Trees mirrored in basalt split by dynamite, grass on a thatched roof, new blades of rice, the water-filled fields reflecting the sky. To think this is where he is from, all this wind, rock, and water, the stuff of his marrow. The Western Ghats, his GPS announces. Trust the British cartographers to ignore the traditional name in favor of a common word for steppes. To his grandparents, this range was always the Sahyadri. He looked the name up online, and it derives from two Sanskrit words. Adri means mountain, and Saya, that which endures. And isn't that perfect? These bizarre ridges go all the way back to Gondwana land. That valley contains dinosaur fossils older than Everest. This is the Sahyadri.
Thank you for that. I really loved how lush that passage was when you were getting to landscapes. So since we're starting with the root store, the root store could be considered an inflection point in Rohit's arc, and it sets the stage for his brush with Omkar and the Bharat Brotherhood, which naturally unsettles some of his friends. I was quite interested in Ifra's response, for one. Given the social world that the Agashes inhabit, I don't see any other sort of Muslim woman occupying the space that Ifra does. She comes from old money. She's this secular, non-practicing girl who parties and drinks and dates a Hindu boy. She's sort of this liberal Hindu ideal of the good Muslim. Have you considered that some of your minor characters, like Ifi, could be read as instruments to prove a point? Like in Ifra's case, her arc sort of testifies to this, oh, even the privileged Muslims are sufficiently rattled by the changes in their social bubbles enough to consider leaving the country. So in a novel like this that's heavily preoccupied with ideas and ethics, the risk that characters could be instruments, is that a risk that any writer who's attempting a novel of this scope has to be willing to take?
That's a really good question, and one that really plagued me throughout the writing of the novel. I think when I started, it wasn't a question on my mind. I had 3 protagonists. I was working with a form that's very well established now in fiction, where you have one perspective coming after another. And it was precisely this concern, the fact that some of the characters felt instrumental, that made me broaden the scope of the novel once I was 2 sections in. And so doing that meant giving not just Ifra a perspective, but giving Cyrus a perspective, giving Mansi a perspective, giving Gyan a perspective. And that is why the novel, the structure of the novel, in a way, does try to embody this kind of widening political consciousness. Now, the question is very valid, kind of why these characters? And why not everybody else? After all, there are several other Muslim characters in the novel itself. A lot of the characters in Deonar are practicing Muslims. You have the character of Salim, who's a good friend of Kedar, who also features in the novel. So kind of why Ifra to the exclusion of other characters? Now, it's true that some of the limits of a novel will be defined by the story that it has embarked to tell. And so it did feel important to me that not just Ifra, but all of those characters in that group of friends, they are very similar in this. None of them are overly religious. None of them are very conscious about their identity along these lines. All of them would think of themselves as liberal and progressive. Many of them are apolitical. And then this becomes an inflection point where suddenly all these differences become apparent. And so that in some way did limit the scope of, or sort of did in some way predetermine which character, or as you said, which kind of Muslim got that moment of interiority, which others in the novel didn't. Was I comfortable with this? No. And I think the novel constantly alludes to everybody who hasn't been given a voice. And you see that in atmosphere. And it's almost begging the reader to ask that question of not only this text, but every text you read. Yeah. We were talking the other day about Anjum Hassan's History's Angel, which is entirely a book written from the perspective of a Muslim man. But that too will have its minor characters. His wife is a minor character. His brother, who is more, or not brother, there's a minor character there who's more radical in his life. So, these are problems that are perhaps endemic to the form. Does that mean we don't question them? Does that mean we don't interrogate them? Does that mean we use some kind of artistic license to never think about these things? No. And I think the book does try to, the title of the session is The Novel in the Age of Anxiety. And it felt important for me to inhabit, for Quarterlife to inhabit that anxiety. And there was a point in the novel where I could have gone back to the beginning and given a wider range of characters the mouthpiece from page 1. But it would have still suffered from the same problems. And so instead, it made sense at some point for the structure to betray those problems, to grapple with those problems, rather than to keep starting from scratch and running into the same thing again. Because this isn't about covering your tracks. This is about opening up a debate and trying to take it forward together.
Glad that you brought up structure because I think that's one of the coolest accomplishments of the book. So for the most part, chapter by chapter, you see the world through Naren, Rohit, and Amanda's eyes, which means you have these, you sort of dive very deep into the characters' inner worlds and see what animates them. And then you have these series of fragmented snapshots from Amanda's time in Dionar. Then my personal favorite, the chapter titled Friends, Brothers, Lovers, where you switch between 9 characters' perspectives, and the buildup of tension in that scene is very slow but also dizzying at the same time. But then by the time we get to the Ganesh Utsav, you sort of abandon that project of interiority and zoom out and out till you get a sort of bird's eye view of Bombay, different parts of Bombay. Like, people become mohallas, they become populations. And so when you set out on writing this book, did you intend for it to be, for the structure to be this complex? And what was it like as a writer to execute this transition in scale from interiority to the sort of bird's eye view? And did you ever fear that this zooming out would compromise the depth of interiority that you'd accomplished in the first 2/3 of the book?
So for me, there's no commitment to interiority as a project. Every section of the novel is attempting to take a certain kind of, argument's really the wrong word because it's not an argument, but its struggle is in response to what has already been resolved or not in the previous section. So for example, initially we have only the interiority of 3 characters. Then suddenly, when it opens up to 9, there was a recognition within the text and perhaps within the reader that, oh, these people that we had seen so narrowly all inhabit these very full worlds that may not have been recognized by even their closest friends. So that point is made. So what would atmosphere have gained by making the same point again? And so I think when I came to atmosphere, what I was curious about is just a whole different set of questions. How far out can we extend that project of interiority? Because atmosphere also has interiority. It's just that it's greatly reduced and spans a much larger group of people. It's also the only section that has an omniscient voice. What happens when, if there is such a thing as a collective consciousness, is it the sum of everybody's interiority? Is there some kind of affect that, is transpersonal, that goes beyond just our, is there a synergy that's more than the sum of the parts? I don't know. There's a lot of interpretations for what that voice could be. I don't want to flatten the reader's experience by giving mine. But I think those were the preoccupations of that section and what it set out to do.
Would you like to read a part from the Ganesh Chaturthi sequence?
So this is a scene from the Ganesh Visarjan parades in Mumbai, which also form the backdrop to the climax of the novel. At the Orient Club, the retired mayor of Mumbai leans over the carved railings to watch the processions coalesce on Chowpatty. The festival is always huge in an election year, and this is a year of 2 elections, the center and the state. But the mayor has never seen such gusto. This is how he imagines the mood during the freedom struggle, when Tilak, the fiery Chitpavan, the father of Indian unrest, led the Ganesh processions in the face of the British. Well, the city no longer needs Tilak. The city resounds with a celebratory mourning. its worship of the end. Yet its conception of time is cyclical, for the final note requests Lord Ganesh to return. Ganpati Bappa Moria, Pucha Varshi Laukarya. The idol may dissolve, but its journey will be retraced in essence, if not in its particulars. A year later, a pandal will rise again in the empty square, a tribute to whatever temple or architect or flower is in vogue, and an avatar reflecting the economy, the political will, and the public sentiment of the times will be crowned Raja of X locality. And in the swirling incense, the ancient chiming of bells, and the hazy adoration of devotees, its tusked face will blend into the one from this year, and all the years past, and each of the 100,000 idols across the city's complex and luminous geography.
Do you want to read the next part as well? Because we're doing okay for time, and I think the next part really touches on what you were talking about, a crowd being more than a sum of its parts. Sure. 321.
Mumbai Central. Ala re ala, a child shouts as the Lal Bagh Raja appears atop a cataract of revelers. The crowd on the flyover tips buckets of rose petals over the rails. The procession on the street below hollers. Women raise lamps from open corridors in every soot-stained shawl and throw fistfuls of dry rice and gulal in the air. Boys cram on the narrow tarp above shop signs, their cell phones flashing. And amidst the waving flags on the 20-foot Raja's float, an old priest wearing only a dhoti and a caste mark thinks, "People of Bappa, color me red." Is that?
So the Ganesh Chaturthi sequence is what the entire book builds up to. And then you have the characters in the wake of what unfolds there and elsewhere. But I found it intriguing that you chose to end the book not with Amanda's chapter, but not an epilogue, as the narrator asserts, but a sort of self-reflexive chapter that is in conversation with the story that's preceding it, ruminating on death, storytelling, characters becoming their own beings. And this is a bit of a personal, selfish question from my part, but as someone who writes poems, I was really excited by the mention of Kolatkar's Jejuri as an influence. Could you talk a little bit more about that influence and what inspired you to end the novel on a note like this, on a coda like this?
I mean, Kolatkar's Jejuri it's a wonderful book of poems, and there were so many other works of poetry from Maharashtra that I read while writing this book. When I was growing up, even though I grew up in Pune and there was sort of Abhang and the Varkaris going every year and the Palki and all of that. It was something that was background noise. It wasn't in the forefront for me in any way. And I had never heard of Jejuri. I never heard of it from my family. I had never been there. It simply wasn't on my map of Maharashtra. And then I read Kolatkar's poems. Jejuri is a temple town, for those of you all who are not from Maharashtra. So it's a temple town, very much like Varanasi or like Wai. And I have still never been there, but I think that conception of this place became so alive for me that now, years later, I must have read this in my teens, I have a deep nostalgia for Jejuri. That's almost false because I have never been there or inhabited it. And though it's a critical work, he talks about the gods like stones and things like that. What it has done is made Jejuri stronger in my imagination. And so when I chose to end the book in Varanasi, that is one of the questions that particular section of the book is plagued by. Does Varanasi rise stronger by virtue of the attention paid to it over these 30 or 40 pages? You may set out to write a book that critiques the national project, but what is it about your obsession with it, Has the project got stronger and subtler by your speaking in these terms? And so these were anxieties, discomforts within me that I felt that moment in the last chapter speaks to, and so that is why in the end the the boat moves in the opposite, to a bank that leaves Varanasi behind. But that's a little bit on Jejuri. There's also the fact of the coda, right? Like why the first person. And for those of you all who haven't read the book, it moves from 3 perspectives to 9 perspectives, 9 characters, to, I don't know, 37 or 40, or like those of a whole city. And then finally it comes back down and ends on 1, which is the perspective of the writer. And there's readers who've loved that and readers who've hated it. But for me, it was just not an option not to have that section. I felt if this is a book about representation, the location of the writer was, the location of the narrator, and I want to make a distinction there, had to be betrayed. And in some sense, that is what the book is saying, that yes, I may have tried to inhabit all these consciousnesses, but ultimately it is the point of view of a woman, a Savarna woman, somebody who maybe grew up in a certain place, spoke a certain language. And so that felt important. It was one of the various reasons, that was not the only reason that I wrote it, but it was one of the various reasons why it felt important to do that. And yes, there is a tension through all of these decisions between what I would think of as the aesthetic and the ethical. Like, should I do what is ethical or should I do what is aesthetic? And an essay that I read that really spoke to me while I was writing this novel was The Author as Producer by Walter Benjamin. And he talks about how it's a false binary. There is no distinction between the moral tendency of a work and the literary tendency of a work. A more ethical work is a formally stronger work. And if there is a kind of disconnect between the form of the work and its professed morality, what an upsetting, what an upsetting irony. And you just can't justify that by saying, like, look, this is my, artist carte blanche. And so for me, it is personally an aesthetically stronger work too, on account of that call. And there I just had to stay true to my vision of the work, regardless of what the editor or what the readers or what anyone else may think, especially given the subject of the book. The same model or the same structure or the same ending may not apply to a book that is not talking democracy, but for a book that is talking about these themes and subjects, how could it not be reflexive about these things? So the anxiety is a part of the project. Yes. Yeah.
I loved how you brought up the question of ethics and aesthetics being pretty much the same thing. They tie into each other. And from an aesthetic point of view, which is also the ethical point of view, I loved how the Varanasi section sort of has a lovely resonance with the idea of the Chitpavan being purified by fire, which is the caste of the Akashes, and which undergirds that caste inquiry undergirds so much of the book. So I'd like to read a small bit from this last self-reflexive chapter to segue into my final question. To call this a novel or a book implies more closure than I wish to claim. Even a work seems incorrect, though it comes nearer to what this is. An effort that another will carry forward, whether or not with any reference to this one. Being one of the earlier novelists in English to take on post-2014 India, do you think that's going to be a whole genre by itself, this Modi era novel? If yes, what would you like to see future novels tackling that this book didn't have the bandwidth for?
I mean, I don't know, the term genre has always unsettled me in some ways. But yes, 2014 was an inflection point in our politics, even though the currents that led into it were much wider. Many of them weren't even necessarily political. And we are still very much living in the pall of that moment, right? And so I do hope for a lot more novels on the subject, and not ones where there's a kind of concession. It's like the novel's about something else, and then suddenly there'll be like one tiny chapter where there's a riot scene or something like that. I'm like, oh yes, that was also happening. But it would be nice to have novels that take this on. One of the things that Quarterlife is so conscious about is that it cannot be the novel of a nation. Yeah. It's just a novel of a place, a group of people. And I want, all of the characters who are not given enough room or any room in this novel to be writing books. You know, may Mansi write a book, may Ifra write a book, may Sheila Bai write a book, may, you know, all of them. And so that's my hope, just that this is not seen as the domain of nonfiction alone, that, you know, that somehow politics is not seen as an unsavory subject, you know, that taints fiction, because fiction has so much to offer. Every domain that it chooses to explore, including this, in a way that the political manifesto cannot, in a way that nonfiction cannot, in a way that movies cannot, in a way that music cannot. So, yeah, I'd just love to see more novels about the Modi era. And I think the questions, of course, keep changing.
Yeah.
I think in 2014, we had a lot of smoke and mirrors, and, you know, some of the book had to stay true to that moment should it come again in history. It couldn't just become teleological and make the characters smarter than they were. But the question for 2024, I mean, what would you say? I think for me, I'd just be curious, why the thrall? Like, there's no smoke and mirrors anymore. The verdict's out. So why is the nation still in thrall? And it would be very exciting to read a book that gives me some answers on that.
I loved what you said about the other voices in the novel getting to write their own novels. And on that expansive note, let's open the floor to questions. Anybody from the audience?
Hi. Am I audible? Hi. So, I come from an age group where I was under the strong belief that India would have been a much better force if it was led by the British forces. India would have been like, say, a Hong Kong today or something like that had Britain continued to conquer India. Sorry? Yeah, okay. I was just telling, I come from an age group or from a group of society which felt that India would have been a much better country, like say something like the Hong Kong, if it had continued to be run by the British till 1990s or to the early 2000s. Until I read the book by Shashi Tharoor, The Era of Darkness, okay, which gave me a completely different perspective of how India was brought to its rumbles and all the Bengal famine and everything that was brought to the fore by Shashi Tharoor. So according to your research, how does India stand in the eyes of Amandas of the US? How does India stand in the eyes of all the IITians who graduate? Is it still different from the 1990s? Or how did your research come to some kind of a conclusion?
You're asking, we couldn't catch the last bit of your question.
The question is, how does India stand in the eyes of the Amandas of the America? And how does India stand in the eyes of the IITians who pass out of the institution today? Is it different from the 1990s where we were talking about brain drain? Or is it different altogether in your research?
So that's a very interesting question. I think it's definitely changed since the 90s. At the time when I came back to India in 13, 14, I was not alone. There was a lot of people coming back. I mean, I didn't really live there for a long time. I was just there for 2 years. But there were those who suddenly felt that in India that there was scope for money to be made, that there was scope for careers to be made, that there were corporate opportunities. And this is not only in the corporate world. This is also in the arts. There was a lot of artists coming back. There was a lot of academics coming back. And you really felt at that time, for a while I was staying in Delhi, you really felt that buzz. And some of that has changed. I think right now, 10 years down, there has been some despondency on that front. There are people who, there was a lot of, in 14, even those who were resisting the government had a feeling of optimism. There was this idea that we'll take to the streets and it'll bring about change. But right now, I do have friends who are literally saying, well, 10 years of our lives have already gone, in this state, and do we want to leave? Do we want to go abroad? Do we want to? There's a lovely book by Akar Patel called The Price of the Modi Years. And one of the things he says in it was that Modi had such an unprecedented amount of power to have really transformed. And here he's not even talking about the social fabric or about communal issues. He's talking about governance. He's talking about the economy. He really had a chance to transform this country given the kind of power he had. And I think that hasn't come to pass. And even those who are Modi supporters have felt some of that. And whether or not their voting reflects it, you can see that some of their financial choices and their career choices are reflecting it. And that is what I've seen. As far as America is concerned, I do think there's a bit more of a split now in how Indians, how the NRI perceives the Modi regime. I think in 13 and even 19, there was a lot of euphoria about it. But right now, there is a sense that there is a divided opinion, that there is a division in terms of where people stand on how they think his regime has gone down in India. I hope that answers your question. I'm sorry we couldn't hear very clearly. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for the session. Started off a bit slow, but then now I'm intrigued to read the book. My question here is that as a writer, as somebody who put words into sounds and then out in the world open, what were your fears? What were your concerns? All of that while writing the book, while sitting here talking to us, how do you feel, as well as what do you look forward to?
I mean, there's the fears that transcend being a writer, right? Like just being a citizen through this time, one has fears that is probably the answer to a different question. But to take on your question on as a writer, I mean, I do think that writing fiction and writing fiction in English does award you some modicum of protection or privilege. And I do also think that sort of India isn't China yet. There's still room to take your chances. And, I guess I'm the kind of person where if there's room to take a chance, I'll take it. And undoubtedly, through the years I wrote the novel, my mom would keep reminding me that it could get me in trouble, it could get the family in trouble. And I don't think her fears were necessarily ill-founded. It just takes one statement for something to catch fire. But like I said, there I don't know, maybe I was foolhardy. Whenever the thought came, I just had this, like, dekenge, we'll see how it lands. But I think what I was much more anxious about and fearful about, and what took me a much longer time to work my way through, was not the violence that I might be at the receiving end of, but that a book like this might perpetrate. Am I representing, other communities in a way that's sensitive, in a way that's backed by research? I'm not at all afraid about offending some vigilante with my views on Shivaji. But I am worried if someone reads the book and feels hurt by a certain kind of representation. And the way I finally, I was recently at an MBA school. I was at IIM Ahmedabad. And a young Dalit writer said to me that she was not writing anymore because she just felt that she didn't in any way, she had been at the receiving end of feeling that text had violated her sense of dignity, and she didn't want to perpetrate that on anybody else. And I think this is something that's, what I encouraged her to do was just write about that, right? Exactly about what you are feeling, and this in itself is literature. But I think, yes, there is that, we are all living in that fear of critique, where, like, if I try to inhabit someone else, like, is that allowed? Am I doing something morally terribly egregious? And the way I finally resolved that within my own project was to betray my location, which is something that the book does. But the other thing I think is that somebody has to take the leap and put down the first card. And so, okay, this is as far as my imagination could go. And I invite the critics to, like I said, to take the project forward, to tell, to say where the book falls short. And I think that's how readers, writers of literature, critics, that's how we take the dialogue forward together. And if we're all so scared of saying a word, we're either either not going to have a literature or all literature that's only written in the I, which would be, I think, a terribly solipsistic project. But that was something that, when you asked about fears, that was something that stayed with me right through the writing process.
Do you think, since we live in a country where, the moment you're a writer and you opens the truth and show it to the world, sounds the truth and make the world sit and listen, your voice can be quashed at any point of time. So do you have, any such thoughts, if I write a fiction with the political backdrop, it might come to that any point of time?
Just repeat the first part of the question, please.
In a country like India, where we have a lot of writers, especially writers or social activists, when they speak about the truth, there are chances that your voice can be quashed at any point in time. So, what are your thoughts about that?
If there's a space, use it. Like, until it's squashed, we'll keep talking and keep writing, and that's the plan, I suppose. I don't know what else to say.
I think that's all we can do, right? We just keep on going with. I think Kedar quotes a poet at some point, like, if I forgot, I think it was a Marathi poet, I don't remember exactly, but he said, whatever's there in my heart, I will keep saying it.
मेरे सीने में नहीं तेरे ही
Yes.
सीने में से ही हो कहीं भी आग लेकिन आग जलनी चाहिए.
Yes, that's
It's a beautiful poem. I would encourage. I have a bad voice, or I would sing it. It's one of those that really.
my voice is worse.
Yeah, but it's a beautiful poem. It's by Dushyant Kumar. It's written in the 60s.
Hindi poet?
He's a Hindi poet.
Yeah.
It's not Marathi. But yeah, it circles back to that thing that we just need more voices, as many voices as possible talking about this. And yeah, less fear.
Yes. Anybody else?
I wanted to ask you if writing so many perspectives were difficult. Like, if you were, writing like distinctive perspectives, or then some characters were, sharing common characteristics, and so was it difficult to write so many perspectives?
Yes, it was definitely difficult. Well, a lot of the pleasure is also in the challenge. Sometimes the frustration is also there. I think one thing that felt important to me was never to take my own assumption of what another perspective might be for granted. One has to make that leap as a writer.
So you had to do a lot of research and go talk to people and understand.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So I did spend a lot of time talking to people. A lot of the characters, for example, even when we were talking about Ifra, given her coordinates, when I talk to people, her views are a sum of, a composite of those views rather than just my own. And so in many ways, the text is bigger than I am. It's smarter than I am. It's got more intelligences in it than my own. And often I felt my task was really just to be able to hold all of that. And not topple.
I'm going to hop onto that. Can you tell me a little bit more about your research process, especially for the character Omkar? I was really curious about how you went about representing that voice.
So it's fiction, so legally one cannot take the names of the organizations one has worked with, and not again just because it's a legal issue, it's an ethical issue as well. But I did, of course, reach out to a lot of young people in right-wing youth organizations, some of them directly involved with political parties, some of them in a sort of auxiliary capacity. And not only in the metros, but many of them in the metros had roots somewhere else. They had sort of come to the metros to study, and often that was the catchment area for these organizations. And Maharashtra is especially interesting, Mumbai is especially interesting, because unlike, say, in Delhi, we've not had student elections since the 90s. There was a young candidate was shot, and following that, a lot of the political parties did really, or not political, a lot of the political parties, youth wings and presences on campus really went down. But some right-wing political parties have persisted in maintaining those kind of networks and offering that kind of support to students like Omkar coming from, Hawaii or from a bead. And so, yes, and so that research process involved talking to them, shadowing them for a long time. So I actually did go to Hawaii, with someone. And to write Hawaii, you have to visit at least a bunch of places. That's why I also went to Bhor. I also went to places on the Konkan coast. And so a lot of it is really, I did not pick it up from other books. I didn't pick it up from social media. It was really reaped right off the ground.
It's almost like you did like anthropological research. There's like literal fieldwork happening there.
Probably, yeah.
I think we have time for one last question. I think we have time for one last question, perhaps. Anybody? Okay, I'm going to ask one last question. Your time at Iowa, how crucial was a program like that for you to grow as a writer? And, do you think workshops or like MFA programs, for example, do you think they could offer like a crucial point of growth for writers in India, especially writing programs abroad? You come from a very different cultural context, so there's this fear that maybe they won't understand what they're critiquing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, see, I've been taught creative writing and I teach creative writing. And one thing I'll say is that if you're not a writer, nobody can teach you to be a writer. Like the engine is either there or it isn't. And this is something I recognize less as a student and more as a teacher. You can give someone all the tips and all the tricks and all the tools, but basically if whatever it is, the talent or the gift isn't there, it's not going to go very far. But if you are somebody who has that, and I don't just mean the talent to write a good sentence, I also mean the psychological makeup that's going to see you through a lifetime of writing, whether it's the endurance, whether it's that maybe ability to retreat inward or go out into the world in a certain way.
Deal with rejections.
Deal with rejections. If a young writer already has all of that, then yes, of course, exposure helps. And, it's funny, I have some friends in New York who haven't done an MFA and they consider themselves self-taught. And it just makes me want to laugh because what is the MFA? There's no structured course of study. You basically meet once a week for some workshops where, somebody's work is critiqued. You attend talks on craft. You discuss books with other people who love books obsessively. It's really not like it's not like a, literature or history. Or,
yeah, it's not a structured course.
Yeah, it's not a structured course. And if you are somebody who's living in New York or living in London and already has writers for friends or grew up where your parents knew intellectuals, you don't need it.
Yeah.
But I didn't have any of that growing up. And so where I was coming from, whether it was my experience in Iowa, whether it was a few years in Delhi, these things really opened me up to a wider literary conversation. They gave me the kind of reading list I might not have chanced upon on my own in Pune. And having done that, it was very necessary on the other side for me to retreat from it. So there were many years when I wrote the book when I was in absolute isolation. I was not in touch with any literary circles. As you know, we missed each other in Pune. I was really not, apart from a few friends, none of whom were sort of writing professionally. It was a period where I was really unlearning a lot of what I'd learned, reacting to a lot of what I'd learned, testing a lot of what I'd learned against the subject that I was trying to write about. But that doesn't mean I should never have learned. You have to learn something to unlearn it. You have to, influence works in two ways. You're influenced by what you accept. You're also influenced by what you reject. And so I think that exposure in my 20s was wonderful and was invaluable, and as much as the isolation that followed. And so if anybody asks me, should I do an MFA? Should I go to Delhi? Especially if they've come from a similar background where they've not had this exposure, but they've not got it in any other capacity, I would say just do it. Don't spend money on it. Do it if you get a scholarship, but if you're getting a scholarship, there's nothing to lose. It's a gift of time. It's a gift of exposure. So.
One last call for any questions from the audience, else we are going to wrap this session. We only have 5 minutes to go, and I'd like to ease the transition for the next session. Anyone? Okay, let's wrap up them. All right, thank you for joining us on the session. Thank you, Devika, for this wonderful conversation.